I'm kind of glad I didn't tell this story a couple of years ago when I first started doing the Beattie stuff, because the storyline or the angle has changed a lot. The conventional wisdom has the Cascade Brewery in South Hobart as being made by an entrepreneur called Peter DeGraves, and he was supposed to be an amazing person. He built the Theatre Royal and did all sorts of amazing things. Problem is that story is a complete lie. Turns out Mr. DeGraves was a thief, a con man, a wanted criminal, and did all sorts of nasty things. G'day and welcome to Forgotten Tasmania. I'm John Stephenson. I tell stories about Tasmania from the historic photos in the Beattie Studio collection. The story of the Cascade Brewery starts with a Scottish gentleman called Hugh McIntosh, born in 1776 to a wealthy family. His sister Sophia married a man called Peter DeGraves, which seems to be the thing that led McIntosh to being erased from the history books. A McIntosh family friend was the illegitimate but acknowledged son of the Earl of Buckinghamshire, Lord Hobart. See where this is going? The McIntosh family probably paid around £500 for a cadetship for young Hugh in the East India Company Army at age 14. By age 16, he'd sailed to Madras with the incoming governor, who was that same Lord Hobart. In 1806, Hugh McIntosh married Mary Nicholson. It's thought that Mary Nicholson was a friend of Mary Shelley, the author that wrote Frankenstein. Hugh and Mary had a son called William, who was born in 1807, but unfortunately Mary died shortly after. McIntosh's military career was over. He was court-martialed for desertion in India, a crime that usually had a death sentence. But McIntosh must have been well-liked or well-connected because he survived the guilty verdict. Peter DeGraves may have come from a family of engravers or printers, hence the name. They were poor and he had debts. He convinces McIntosh to go to Hobart Town in Van Diemen's Land to make their fortune. McIntosh bought a ship called the Hope with his own money, and he was the sole owner. DeGraves lied about that and insured the vessel under his name with Lloyd's of London. DeGraves managed to get a first-class rating for insurance purposes with Lloyd's, but the ship was actually in very poor condition, which is why McIntosh only paid £850 for it, when ships were worth about £2,000 in those days. It was over 230 tonnes, built in 1793 of English oak. Unfortunately, it had a worm infestation. DeGraves made lots of promises about the ship, and the standard of accommodations and the amount of freight they were able to take, and the types of meals and things they'd be serving. None of these promises were met, so it's very likely that DeGraves was a con man. The ship was overloaded, overcrowded, and had terrible conditions. It was leaking. There were complaints made to the Lord Mayor of London, but the ship sailed off before the complaints could be investigated. DeGraves seems to have failed to pay for the sawmill equipment that he loaded on board. The ship was leaking so badly that they stopped at Ramsgate, where it was impounded, and McIntosh and DeGraves were imprisoned. The government ended up chartering another ship to take the passengers that were stranded there for months while the court case dragged on. The passengers never got their fares refunded. Lloyd's of London paid out for the damage to the Hope and paid for it to be repaired, but it looks like it was a bit of an insurance scam. The Hope later sank in 1827 off South Arm, and it's said that the Iron Pot Lighthouse was erected to prevent further tragedies. It's also said that the Hope was carrying treasure and that it's still to be found somewhere off Bruny Island, but people say a lot of things. In September of 1823, the Hope finally left for Hobart Town. It stopped in Cape Town, South Africa, where there was another problem with the captain. But in April of 1824, it arrived in Hobart Town. You'll recall that McIntosh was a widower, so he went on to Sydney to pursue Mary Reeby, who appears on our $20 note. McIntosh returned to Hobart and set up along the banks of the Derwent near Bridgewater, somewhere between New Norfolk and Bridgewater, opposite land owned by Governor Arthur. DeGraves had started to build a sawmill. He decided on water power, and the perfect spot for that was the Cascades on the Hobart Town rivulet, but the land was owned by somebody else, a Mr. Robert Murray. DeGraves moved the boundaries and then bribed the government surveyor to cover it up. There was a 7-year legal battle between Murray and DeGraves over the ownership of that land. Murray ended up winning, but was only awarded £300 for his land, and by that stage DeGraves had already built on it, so he got to keep it. In 1825, the London creditors finally caught up with DeGraves. He was arrested in 1826 and went to prison for 5 years for unpaid debts. In 1826, McIntosh advertised that their partnership had been dissolved and that he was paying all the debts personally. DeGraves had established a flour mill and a brewery, and he tried to get a water supply contract from Governor Arthur for reticulated water in Hobart, basically wanted to set up like Taswater. In 1835, he dammed the Hobart town rivulet, stopping the water supply to Hobart, and that was another legal battle. Mackintosh died in 1834. His share of the enterprise would have gone to his son, but the son was never heard of again, and Peter DeGraves got the lot. DeGraves built the Theatre Royal using public subscription, and there were legal disputes until 1839 when he became the sole owner. In 1847, he built the largest sailing ship ever made in Tasmania. He was also imprisoned for threatening a newspaper reporter who wrote bad things about him. DeGraves died in 1850, aged 74 years. He left the business to his son Henry, who died aged 43, and in fact the whole DeGraves family name had vanished by the end of the 19th century. The brewery is now owned by a public company and has no relationship to its colourful beginnings. They still make a fine beer though. This new research on the Cascade Brewery story and the part that DeGraves and Mackintosh played was all from work done by Greg Jefferys. In fact, his work was so good, it's a fantastic read, his work was so good that it earned him a PhD. I've used a lot of stock photographs in the making of this episode, and of course that's because we didn't have cameras back in the 1700s, so I can't show you a photo of Mackintosh, and I can't show you photographs of the East India Company because we just didn't have the cameras back then. I'd like to thank the photographers on Unsplash, who I've used a lot of their work, and the one of Tower Bridge, that was my own work from our trip to England in 2017. All the credits for the photos and the music and all the other things are in the description below, as well as a link to the script and the research, so have a look in the description section. Don't forget to subscribe, like and comment, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Cheers!